What would happen if beings of unimaginable power, gods who shape the fate of galaxies with a thought, turned their gaze upon the Eldar Empire and found it wanting? In the silent void between stars, where light itself seemed to tremble, the craft-world Eandon drifted like a ghost among the shattered remnants of its once great empire. Its golden spires, carved with intricate runes older than most human civilizations, gleamed faintly in the void, reflections of a glory long decayed. Yet even amid the beauty, there was a tension that pulsed like a heartbeat, one that the Eldar could not ignore. Something had arrived in the warp, something unlike the cold calculations of the Chaos Gods, unlike the subtle manipulations of Slaanesh that had haunted them for millennia. Something alien. The Farseers of Eandon had long sensed ripples in the immaterium, tremors of a destiny both inevitable and terrifying. They whispered among themselves in the crystal chambers, voices like wind through hollowed bone. The Watchers approach. One murmured, and the other's eyes widened with an emotion that bordered on fear. Not of this universe, not of our reckoning, yet they judge all that exists. Far beyond, in a dimension that human minds could barely comprehend, the Celestials stirred. Titans of incomprehensible magnitude, beings whose very existence had shaped the fates of galaxies in the Marvel continuum, had turned their scrutiny to a universe they did not belong to. Their judgment was impartial, absolute, and devastating. The Eldar, masters of foresight, of probability, of weaving destinies into the tapestry of fate itself, had never considered that there might be eyes that see beyond the warp, beyond the gods. Beyond the stars, on Eandon's surface, the population stirred uneasily. Ghost warriors patrolled the deserted streets, their spectral forms flickering between visibility and the immaterium, as if the very fabric of reality hesitated before the arrival of these Titans. Children who had survived the fall of their world whispered questions they did not understand. Are they gods? Are they death? Their parents, hardened by centuries of war, could not answer. The words died in their throats, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than any battlefield ash. In the heart of the craft world, the Council of Seers gathered around a pool of shimmering liquid psychic energy, the currents of which were disturbed as if by an unseen hand. "The omens are clear," said Eldrad Ulthran, his voice calm but heavy with dread. "A judgment comes not of chaos, not of the Emperor, not of any known power. Something beyond our reckoning watches us now, and what it sees, it will judge." Their seers' visions unfolded in fragmented bursts, entire worlds being obliterated by light so pure it burned through the essence of matter itself, cities crumbling into dust without warning, minds of the Eldar unraveling under the weight of their scrutiny. And yet, in the center of these visions, the Celestials themselves appeared, statuesque and unyielding, their forms incomprehensible yet blindingly present. They were not bound by morality, by compassion, by cruelty. They simply were, and their gaze alone could reduce civilizations to nothing or elevate them to cosmic significance. Deep in the warp, where the immaterium twisted and convulsed under the weight of millennia of human folly and Eldar hubris, psychic echoes screamed. Farseers cast their minds outward, trying to pierce the veil between dimensions. They glimpsed what could not be fully understood, worlds stripped bare of meaning, the very soul of the Eldar laid bare like a tapestry under a divine eye. Even the strongest psychers felt their minds fragment under the sheer intensity of observation. Meanwhile, the Eldar's aspect warriors prepared for confrontation as best they could. Swooping hawks sharpened their blades, dire avengers meditated with ritual precision, howling banshees let the screams of the past echo in their minds, honing focus into lethal anticipation. Yet even they, warriors without peer, knew that their blades, their precision, their centuries of tactical genius were meaningless before a judgment that transcended time, space, and understanding. Itself, the ancient prophecies, long inscribed in the hidden vaults of the craft world, spoke of a reckoning that came from the stars. Not a reckoning of chaos, nor of the Emperor, but something beyond. Something older and more indifferent than even the cruelest of warp entities. Eldrad Ulthran had read these prophecies countless times, but never had he imagined them to be literal. "We have waited for ruin," he said, "but ruin has its eyes now, and it does not look away." As the craft world drifted further into the void, a blinding light erupted in the distance, so vast it dwarfed entire star systems. The Eldar gazed upon it, hearts pounding in a chorus of dread. Ships shuddered, psychic shields screamed under strain, and even the most stoic warriors felt the pull of something primordial, something that defied every law they knew. The Celestials had arrived. Then came the first contact, not a war, not an attack, but a touch, a subtle bending of reality, as if the very atoms of Eandon recognized the presence of a higher order. Time itself seemed to dilate, memories stretching into infinity. Farseers felt centuries pass in seconds. Young Eldar felt their entire lives unfold in a heartbeat. And the Council realized the nature of what was happening. This was no negotiation, no dialogue, no battle. It was observation. And observation was judgment. Every choice the Eldar had ever made, their wars against the Imperium, their betrayals of kin, their dealings with Slaanesh, was laid bare. Every secret hidden in the labyrinthine corridors of craftworlds, every unspoken thought, every manipulation of fate, was visible to eyes that judged without bias, without mercy, without emotion. Yet even as dread filled the hearts of all who could perceive it, a flicker of hope sparked. For the Eldar, civilization born of foresight and cunning, this might be a chance to prove that their empire, though fractured and decayed, still had worth in the eyes of the cosmos. But even hope trembled in the shadow of titans who could obliterate meaning with a glance. And so, Eandon waited, not for battle, not for mercy, not for deliverance, but for judgment. The Celestials, whose myths in a far-off universe spoke of creation and destruction in equal measure, now focused on a race of beings whose destiny had always been a tightrope between annihilation and survival. The stars themselves seemed to hold their breath. What would the judgment reveal? Would the Eldar, masters of fate and time, find themselves elevated to cosmic guardianship, or reduced to the nothingness their arrogance had long flirted with? In that instant, as silence stretched between the craft world and the incomprehensible titans, the universe seemed to pause, trembling on the edge of revelation. Even the ghosts of fallen Eldar warriors stirred in their tombs, sensing the cosmic reckoning. Their whispers, usually lost to the void, carried a warning. This is not war. This is the end of understanding itself. In that terrifying moment, Eandon's leaders, warriors, and seers understood a truth older than any prophecy. The universe did not owe them mercy, and the Celestials were not bound by empathy or fear. They were judgment incarnate, impartial and absolute, and what they decided now would echo through eternity. As the light of the Celestials bathed the craft world, the Eldar braced themselves, not for a battle of blades or guns, but for the revelation of cosmic truth. And somewhere in a dimension beyond comprehension, the Titans looked upon the Eldar Empire, and the first verdict of infinity began to take shape. How can a civilization survive when its very soul is dissected by eyes older than galaxies themselves? The Eldar of Eandon had lived millennia under the constant shadow of decay and war, but nothing had prepared them for the presence of the Celestials. These were not gods of legend, not entities that could be bargained with, nor foes that could be outmaneuvered. They were a force beyond comprehension, their will intertwined with the essence of creation itself. Every pulse of their cosmic gaze rippled through the craft world, warping reality with an almost imperceptible touch. Even the warp recoiled, its turbulent currents quivering like frightened children. Eldrad Ulthran stood before the central pool of psychic energy, his hands hovering above its surface as the visions became unbearable in their intensity. The images were no longer fragmented, they were complete, horrifyingly whole. Worlds rose and fell like the tide, civilizations danced and died in a pattern both beautiful and devastating. The Eldar saw their own empire in this chaos, proud, majestic, yet fragile beyond reckoning. Every decision they had made over countless millennia, the betrayals, the wars, the deals with the shadow of Slaanesh, was laid bare in stark relief. Yet even in the face of such scrutiny, the Eldar found themselves unable to look away. The Celestials did not merely observe, they analyzed, measured, and judged. A civilization that had survived the insatiable hunger of chaos now found itself naked before a verdict that transcended morality. No longer was Eandon fighting for survival against a known enemy. It was being weighed on a scale that held nothing but infinity itself. In the streets below, the aspect warriors maintained their ritual vigilance, though many felt the futility pressing against their very souls. The howling banshees' wails, once a weapon of terror, now echoed like futile pleas against an indifferent universe. Dire avengers and fire dragons alike tightened grips on their weapons, their every instinct screaming that no amount of skill could pierce the veiled judgment sweeping across their world. And yet, the Eldar were not entirely defenseless. Their foresight, their mastery of probability, gave them a sliver of comprehension. Farseers strained their minds outward, searching for patterns within the incomprehensible, attempting to anticipate the shape of cosmic will. They understood one terrifying truth. These were not entities that could be defeated, but they could be understood. Knowledge, perhaps, could be their shield. Far above Eandon, the void itself seemed to fracture. Stars twisted into impossible geometries, entire constellations rearranged in silent protest. The Celestials had not yet touched Eandon directly, but their presence alone was enough to strain the laws of reality. Ships groaned as gravitic fields twisted unnaturally. Psychic shields shimmered and flared with energy that could not exist, a warning of forces that bent the very framework of existence. It was then that the first direct communication occurred not through words, but through understanding. The Celestials projected their perception into the minds of the Eldar, a torrent of pure awareness that shattered barriers of language and thought. Every Eldar who perceived it understood the same thing. We are being judged, and the result is inevitable. The Farseers, attempting to interpret this overwhelming influx, saw glimpses of a universe in which the Eldar Empire had never existed. They saw the consequences of pride, of hubris, of choices that had once seemed minor, but now loomed as catastrophes of cosmic significance. And still, within the visions, there was a faint glimmer of hope, a single thread of possibility. Eandon's survival depended not on combat, but on clarity, on understanding, on the willingness to confront the truth of their own existence without flinching. In this psychic maelstrom, Eldrad Ulthran felt the weight of centuries pressing upon him. His mind, normally a fortress of control and prescience, threatened to fracture under the raw intensity of the Celestials' perception. Memories of fallen comrades, of battles won and lost, of worlds abandoned and civilizations betrayed, flowed through him like a river of fire. And yet, amid the chaos, a single certainty crystallized. Eandon's future depended on acknowledgement, not denial. The Eldar could not hide, they could not manipulate, they could only confront the truth, and hope it was enough. As if, in response to this realization, the Celestials shifted their focus. The light emanating from them intensified, bathing the craft world in a brilliance that was at once awe-inspiring and destructive. It penetrated the psychic shields, washed over the spires, and seeped into the minds of every living and spectral being on the planet. For the first time, the Eldar felt seen not as warriors, not as gods, not as pawns in some larger cosmic game, but as a civilization, flawed and beautiful in equal measure. Yet with visibility came vulnerability. The Celestials did not merely judge, they tested. Each Eldar faced visions tailored to their soul. Warriors relived the horrors of battles past. Farseers saw futures that might never come to pass, and the ghosts of the dead whispered accusations. That cut sharper than any blade. The craftworld itself seemed to breathe, shifting subtly as though it were alive and aware of its own evaluation. Despite the fear, some Eldar sensed a peculiar pattern in the judgment. The Celestials' attention was not uniform, it was discerning, selective, almost surgical. Certain aspects of the Eldar civilization, creativity, foresight, the resilience of their souls, were weighed alongside failure, hubris, and betrayal. Even the fragments of Eandon's broken empire, the hollow victories, and the bitter memories of loss were considered in the balance. The question that haunted them all was simple yet impossible to answer. Could a civilization that had flirted so often with self-destruction demonstrate enough worth to survive a judgment? Infinity, as the hours, or perhaps eons, for time now flowed inconsistently under the Celestials' gaze past. The first cracks began to appear in Eandon's psychic defenses. Not cracks of failure, but of revelation. The Eldar began to understand that this judgment was not merely punitive, it was transformative. Their civilization's sins and virtues alike were catalysts, and how they responded would shape the fabric of reality itself. Farseers convened in the deepest crystal chambers, their minds intertwined as they attempted to weave a single, coherent understanding of the Celestials' purpose. Every thread of foresight, every flicker of intuition was strained to its limit. And then, collectively, they saw it. The Celestials were not here to destroy indiscriminately, nor were they here to reward unconditionally. They were measuring potential, the capacity of a civilization to transcend its flaws, to endure beyond the bounds of understanding, to exist as a meaningful force in a universe where most were reduced to dust. It was a revelation that brought both terror and clarity. Eandon's leaders understood that every decision, every act of courage, every moment of sacrifice would now carry weight beyond imagination. The survival of their people depended not on weapons, not on stealth, not on cunning, but on the essence of what it meant to be Eldar. And so the craftworld held its breath. Every Eldar living, dead, and spectral felt the pull of judgment as though the universe itself were a scale and Eandon balanced upon it. The Farseers realized that the Celestials' evaluation was ongoing, dynamic, and responsive. They were not witnesses, they were catalysts, forcing the Eldar to confront truths they had long avoided. The first act of the judgment had begun. It would not be simple, nor would it be kind. The Celestials' gaze pierced not only flesh and mind, but the very narrative of history itself. Eandon's victories, its defeats, its betrayals, its sacrifices, all were now subject to scrutiny beyond comprehension. And in that gaze, the Eldar felt the exhilarating, terrifying possibility of transformation or annihilation. As the light of the Celestials reached its zenith, the first words of understanding came. Not spoken, but known. You are weighed, the Eldar felt in their minds, and your measure will decide if your flame endures, or if it is extinguished forever. For the first time in millennia, Eandon felt its fragility, not as a weakness, but as the truth upon which the universe itself might hinge. And in that silence stretched across the cosmos, the Eldar knew one final, haunting certainty. The judgment had only begun, and nothing, no skill, no foresight, no history, would prepare them for what came next. What does it mean to be truly seen, not by your enemies, not by your gods, but by entities whose awareness stretches across galaxies and eons, whose judgment is both immediate and eternal? The craftworld Eandon trembled beneath the cosmic gaze. Every spire, every shard of psychic crystal, every ghost warrior and living Eldar vibrated with the awareness that their civilization's soul was being measured. The Celestials were not merely watching. They were reading, calculating, probing. Their perception flowed into the very structure of the craft world, touching its foundations, brushing against its warp, stained arteries, whispering questions too vast for mortal or Eldar comprehension. Eldrad Ulthran, seated at the center of the council, felt the pressure of eternity pressing against his mind. He had faced the encroaching forces of chaos, the machinations of the Imperium, the silent devastation of tyrannid swarms. But none of these compared to this. None had forced him to confront the raw truth of existence itself. The universe does not bend for heroes or saints, he thought, and even the idea of foresight seemed fragile against such incomprehensible scrutiny. Farseers meditated in synchronized trance, trying to thread a pattern through the chaos of perception that the Celestials radiated. They saw their empire in flames and frost, in shadows and brilliance, and yet always there was a constant. The judgment flowed like a river, impartial and absolute. It asked not for answers, but for essence. Eandon's worth was being measured not in victories, but in the depth of its being. Beneath the council chambers, in the streets and towers, the aspect warriors moved with uneasy grace. Swooping hawks glided silently, yet their psychic senses screamed that this was no battle they could fight with weapons or strategy. Dire avengers, their armor etched with the runes of millennia, remained still, absorbing visions that fractured the mind. Even the youngest guardians felt the weight of eternity pressing upon their shoulders, their lives a fleeting heartbeat against the infinite expanse of judgment. The first tangible effects of the Celestials' presence began to manifest. Reality itself seemed to resist them. Gravity fluctuated in strange pulses. Entire sections of the craft world shifted subtly, as if breathing in tandem with the titanic observers. Warp currents, normally chaotic and violent, twisted into intricate patterns that mirrored the structure of the craft world, revealing fractures in probability and destiny alike. The Farseers realized that these distortions were not accidents. They were tests. Eandon's history, long preserved in psychic memory and crystal archives, was laid bare before the Eldar themselves. Entire victories, once thought glorious, now seemed hollow. Entire betrayals, once concealed, now burned with clarity. Ghosts of the fallen whispered their truths, each voice a fragment of guilt or defiance. Even Eldrad felt himself confronted by choices he had rationalized, seeing them in a light that illuminated consequences across centuries. The Celestials' perception was selective yet exhaustive. Certain Eldar, whose decisions had shaped the fate of worlds, felt their every act magnified, every intention laid bare. Farseers who had manipulated probabilities to save entire civilizations saw the fragility of those successes. Warriors who had struck down legions of enemies understood the fleeting nature of their victories. Nothing could be hidden. The Celestials were not cruel, nor were they kind. They were the measure of existence itself. In the midst of this, a revelation emerged. Eandon's resilience, the ability of its people to endure despair and loss, was being noted. Their creativity, their ability to shape the warp, their foresight in navigating the treacherous currents of destiny. These were being weighed against arrogance, hubris, and the ever-present shadow of chaos. The Celestials' judgment was not instantaneous destruction, but a meticulous examination of potential, the potential of a civilization to transcend its flaws and endure in the face of infinite scrutiny. But the Eldar also sensed danger. Each manifestation of judgment was accompanied by subtle shifts in reality that could unravel the craft world itself. Swooping hawks reported entire sections of the city becoming intangible for moments, their forms phasing in and out of existence. Dire avengers noticed weapons flickering between solid and spectral states, as if probability itself could no longer be trusted. Even the most disciplined minds felt the creeping terror that the very laws of nature might bend and break under observation. The council convened again, their voices hushed under the pressure of the psychic storm. Eldrad spoke, voice trembling yet firm. "We are being tested not for glory, not for conquest, but for essence. Our victories, our failures, our very existence are being weighed. We must confront the truth of who we are, without denial, without embellishment. Only then can we hope to endure." Farseers began an unprecedented ritual, weaving their consciousness into a single psychic lattice in an attempt to communicate with the Celestials. Not to bargain, not to plead, but to understand. The ritual stretched the limits of sanity. Minds intertwined, memories overlapped, emotions collided in a symphony of psychic energy that threatened to implode. Yet through this collective effort, a faint response emerged. Patterns of perception, threads of understanding, subtle indications that the Celestials' evaluation was not static. They were interacting with the Eldar, probing the depths of possibility, not merely cataloging failure. Meanwhile, in the spires above, the living and the dead mingled unnaturally. Ghost warriors drifted through the light of the Celestials, their forms flickering as if reality itself could no longer define them. Children of the craft world, unaware of the full scale of the judgment, sensed the awe and fear in the air, whispering prayers older than time. Even the ancient machines of the Eldar, constructs older than most stars, hummed with energies they had never contained, vibrating in resonance with the incomprehensible titans beyond. The first direct consequence of the judgment became apparent when a section of Eandon's psychic lattice began to collapse under the weight of perception. Time folded over itself. Events from centuries past occurred simultaneously with imagined futures. Eldar, who had died in battles long forgotten, appeared, interacting with the living in spectral loops. The aspect warriors fought shadows of themselves, battling ghosts of decisions yet to be made. The craft world itself seemed to test its own boundaries, questioning whether it could survive the relentless scrutiny of beings for whom time, space, and morality were trivial. Amid this chaos, Eldrad Ulthran realized a horrifying possibility. The Celestials did not merely judge, they sculpted. The distortions in reality, the loops of time, the phasing of existence, were more than tests, they were interventions. Subtle manipulations intended to reveal the core of Eandon's essence. The Eldar were no longer simply under observation. They were being shaped, guided, and challenged on a level that made gods of their previous enemies seem petty in comparison. The Council of Seers debated, their voices tinged with desperation and revelation. "If we fail this trial," one whispered, "not as warriors, but as civilization, we may be erased. Not just our bodies, but our history, our meaning, our presence in the cosmos obliterated as if we never existed." Eldrad's mind raced, calculating probabilities, yet every calculation was dwarfed by the incomprehensible scale of the Celestials' power. "Then we must succeed," he replied, "not with weapons, not with trickery, but with truth. Our survival depends on what we truly are, not what we wish to be." The first echoes of understanding passed through the craft world. Some Eldar felt clarity, an almost spiritual awakening under the titanic gaze. Others succumbed to despair, their minds fractured by the impossibility of comprehension. Ghosts and spirits whispered secrets that had long been hidden, and even the aspect warriors, stoic and disciplined, felt the burden of centuries pressed upon their soul. The Celestials' light intensified, suffusing every corner of Eandon. Their gaze, impartial and unyielding, illuminated both brilliance and failure, and in doing so, forced the Eldar to confront an immutable truth. Survival was no longer determined by skill, luck, or cunning. It would be determined by essence, by clarity of being, by the willingness to face the infinite and emerge whole. And in that moment, as the craft world trembled and the stars themselves seemed to hold their breath, the Eldar understood the enormity of their task. They were not facing a battle they could win with arms, They were not facing an enemy they could deceive or outmaneuver. They were facing judgment itself, and the scale of it was absolute, eternal, and inescapable. In the shadow of eternity, Eandon held its breath. The first act of judgment had reshaped the craft world and its people irrevocably. The Celestials were no longer distant observers, they were catalysts, sculpting the fates of a civilization in ways that defied comprehension. And as the Eldar braced for the next phase, one truth burned brighter than any fear. The universe had turned its gaze upon them, and nothing would ever be the same. What does it mean to survive when the universe itself tests you not with fire or steel, but with the weight of infinite scrutiny? The craft world Eandon no longer felt entirely real. Its spires shimmered and bent under the pressure of perception. Time folded in jagged loops, and shadows of the past merged with possible futures in an eerie symphony. Even the most disciplined aspect warriors felt the pull of unreality tugging at their senses, forcing them to question what was solid, what was memory, and what was truth. In the eyes of the Celestials, the very fabric of the Eldar Empire had become malleable, an object lesson in essence rather than structure. Eldrad Ulthran, standing at the center of the psychic lattice, sensed the first phase of judgment shifting. This was no longer observation alone. It was a trial. The Celestials were probing the limits of Eandon's civilization, testing its adaptability, resilience, and honesty before infinity itself. Every decision the Eldar had ever made was now being reflected back at them, magnified and transformed into challenges beyond comprehension. In the streets below, the aspect warriors experienced the effects firsthand. Howling banshees screamed not in war but in psychic resonance, their wails ripping through time and memory. Dire avengers moved through corridors that sometimes existed and sometimes did not, their paths twisting in impossible geometries. Even swooping hawks felt the rules of physics bend around them, their flight now guided by unseen forces that tested their coordination, precision, and resolve. Every maneuver was a trial of mind and body alike. The first manifestation of the Celestials' judgment was subtle yet terrifying. A shard of the craft world, a once stable district, began to phase into a parallel version of itself, a reflection of what it could have been had different choices been made. Buildings shimmered with impossible angles, and spectral forms of Eldar who had died in ages past walked alongside the living, engaging in conversations that had never happened. Farseers immediately recognized the pattern. The Celestials were replaying the entirety of Eandon's potential, past, and unrealized futures as a test of comprehension and adaptability. In the council chamber, Eldrad Ulthran convened with the other Farseers. "This is the first trial," he said gravely. "We are being measured not just for survival, but for understanding. If we cannot navigate the truth of our civilization, our successes, our failures, our essence, then the consequences will be absolute." The council's psychic link stretched across the craft world, weaving together knowledge, foresight, and instinct into a single lattice of awareness. It was an unprecedented act of unity, one designed to confront the Celestials' test collectively. Each Eldar poured their memories and foresight into the lattice, exposing everything: triumphs, mistakes, betrayals, and regrets. The psychic strain was immense, threatening to tear them apart mentally and spiritually. Yet they persevered, knowing the cost of failure was more than death. It was erasure. Meanwhile, the citizens of Eandon felt the trial's pressure differently. Children saw visions of endless stars, futures in which their empire had been obliterated or elevated to a brilliance beyond imagination. Priests and craft-world artisans, steeped in tradition, struggled to reconcile their long-held beliefs with the undeniable truth of scrutiny. Even ghosts of fallen warriors felt the weight of judgment, their spectral forms shifting as they confronted actions they had taken in life and consequences that had rippled through time. The first challenge of the trial became evident when a section of the craft world collapsed into a paradoxical loop. Buildings and streets duplicated and vanished, intersecting with themselves across multiple dimensions. Swooping hawks had to navigate paths that alternated between physical reality and spectral possibility, and those who misjudged their movement risked being lost in a temporal void. The Celestials were testing not only courage and skill, but the Eldar's ability to perceive and adapt to realities beyond comprehension. Farseers meditated intensely, probing the lattice for solutions. "We must accept the full spectrum of our history," one whispered. "Not just our victories, but our betrayals, our failures, our pride, everything. Only then can we navigate the trial." Eldrad nodded. "We cannot fight this trial," he replied. "We can only understand it and survive by mastering the truth of what we are." As the day, or what passed for day in the warped perception of time, stretched on, the first true test of essence began. Ghost warriors, phasing between the spectral and physical realms, were forced to relive the consequences of their actions, witnessing lives they had spared destroyed, comrades they had betrayed, resurrected in agony. Dire avengers were confronted with choices they had never made, each path branching into outcomes of suffering and glory. Even the craftworld's infrastructure seemed alive, responding to the Eldar's psychic clarity and testing their collective unity. It became clear that the Celestials' judgment was not punitive in a conventional sense. They did not seek destruction, they sought comprehension. Eandon's survival depended on its ability to confront itself fully, without illusion or denial. Every act of courage, every moment of insight, every acknowledgement of failure was weighed against misjudgment, hubris, and denial. The craftworld had to navigate a labyrinth of potentialities that defied conventional logic, bending time and perception itself into a crucible of trial. The first casualties of incomprehension appeared in subtle ways. Minor fractures in psychic shields, fleeting disorientation among aspect warriors, and brief collapses of spatial reality signaled the danger of failing to adapt. Yet these were warnings, not final judgments. The Celestials were guiding, probing, and testing, offering Eandon a chance to prove its essence against forces that dwarfed gods. Eldrad Ulthrin realized the enormity of what was required. This was not a test of power or cunning, but of civilization itself. Eandon's people, their past and present, their choices and mistakes, were all under scrutiny. Every Eldar who failed to reconcile with their own essence threatened the collective potential of the craftworld. Survival was contingent not on strength but on truth, and then came the first glimpse of hope. In the psychic lattice, a coherent pattern began to emerge. The Farseers, working in harmony, detected threads of resilience and clarity. The Celestials' influence, while overwhelming, seemed responsive. Decisions made with honesty, courage, and insight created stabilizing nodes in the fractured reality. Each act of comprehension, each acknowledgement of past mistakes, reinforced the craftworld's integrity. Eandon began to stabilize, slowly but perceptibly. Sections of the craftworld that had warped into paradoxes reformed into coherent spaces, guided by the clarity of the Eldar's understanding. Ghost warriors regained cohesion, and the aspect warriors navigated their shifting paths with increasing certainty. Even the psychic lattice itself hummed with energy, resonating with the presence of the Celestials while remaining intact. The Council of Seers convened again, exhausted but resolute. "We are beginning to navigate the trial," Eldrad said. "Not by defeating it, but by confronting it fully. This is the path the Celestials demand: truth, clarity, and the courage to face the infinite." Yet even in this moment of progress, the Eldar felt the shadow of what was yet to come. The first trial had revealed not only the fragility of their civilization, but also its potential. The Celestials' judgment was far from complete, and the next challenges would demand even deeper comprehension, unity, and insight. Failure was no longer a distant threat. It was a tangible, creeping force, always present, always watching. In the eerie light of the Celestials, Eandon's citizens, warriors, and ghosts alike held their collective breath. The first trial had begun, reshaping their world and their understanding of themselves. And as the craft world stabilized under the delicate balance of perception and essence, one truth became undeniable. The universe had turned its gaze upon the Eldar, and the next trial would be even more merciless. What happens when survival is no longer guaranteed, when the very laws of existence bend around your civilization, and when the watchers beyond comprehension decide that observation alone is insufficient? The craft world Eandon had stabilized, but it trembled beneath the weight of anticipation. The first trial had tested understanding and adaptation. The next phase was far more severe. The Celestials' light, once a radiant but passive presence, now sharpened like a blade, illuminating flaws and amplifying weakness. Time and space on the craft world flexed unnaturally, entire districts bending into impossible geometries. Gravity reversed in fleeting pulses, and shadows moved independently of their sources. The Eldar realized the second phase had begun, the trial of consequence. In the council chamber, Eldred Ulthrin's face was etched with lines deeper than age, his eyes reflecting the incomprehensible spectacle outside. "We have passed the first test," he said, voice taut with controlled urgency. "But comprehension alone will not protect us. Now we must endure the consequences of our existence. Our actions, our mistakes, our pride, all will manifest before us." The first manifestation of consequence appeared in the skies above Eandon. Entire fleets, long lost to time and war, shimmered into existence, not as they had been, but as echoes of potentialities gone awry. Ghostly vessels of the Eldar Armada materialized, their crews twisted into forms both familiar and alien. Some were warriors who had died centuries ago. Others were variations of Eldar who might have existed had different choices been made. These spectral fleets moved with eerie precision, enacting battles that had never occurred, yet each strike carried the weight of reality, tearing rifts in the warp that echoed across the craft world. Swooping hawks were the first to respond, their flight honed to navigate the fractured skies. Yet even their unparalleled agility proved insufficient. Some hawks vanished into the folds of impossible space, only to reappear moments or centuries later, bearing the psychic scars of timeless loops. The Celestials' judgment was no longer passive. It shaped events in real time, forcing the Eldar to confront the consequences of actions that spanned millennia. On the ground, the Aspect Warriors faced spectral opponents that mirrored their own worst choices. Dire Avengers engaged with phantasms that anticipated every move, each strike a reflection of past arrogance or failure. Howling banshees screamed at enemies that existed only in potentiality, yet the sound carried a psychic force so intense it shredded the minds of those unprepared. Even the Guardians of Eandon found themselves haunted by visions of comrades they had failed to protect, their screams echoing across impossible corridors. Within the psychic lattice, Farseers struggled to maintain coherence. The Celestials' presence intensified, probing their collective consciousness with relentless precision. Every failure, every lapse in judgment, manifested as tangible peril. Entire sections of the craftworld's infrastructure phased in and out of existence, forcing civilians and warriors alike to navigate shifting realities. Eldred Ulthrin realized the horrifying truth. The Celestials were not merely testing. They were executing a living simulation of consequence, forcing the Eldar to confront outcomes of infinite variables simultaneously. Amid this chaos, the first fractures of despair appeared. Some Eldar, unable to withstand the psychic pressure, collapsed into catatonia or vanished into temporal rifts. Even seasoned warriors felt the creeping terror of erasure, an instinctive understanding that failure in this trial might mean not death, but total obliteration of existence. Ghost warriors, normally bound by discipline, fragmented into echoes of themselves, their memories and actions repeating endlessly in looping torment. Yet amid despair, threads of resistance emerged. Eldar Ulthran and the Council recognized a pattern in the chaos: clarity of thought, acknowledgement of past failings, and acceptance of potential outcomes created stabilizing anchors in the reality around them. Each Eldar who confronted their choices without denial contributed to the resilience of the craft world. Understanding and essence became weapons in a war with no enemies, shields against forces that defied conventional comprehension. The trial intensified. The Celestial's judgment reached into the psychic and physical fabric of Eandon, creating spatial paradoxes that merged life, death, and possibility. Entire districts looped through centuries in moments. Citizens interacted with versions of themselves that had never existed, and spectral horrors enacted every conceivable betrayal and mistake. Time fractured, perception wavered, and reality itself seemed to scream in protest. The Eldar had no choice but to respond collectively. The Council of Seers wove a lattice of psychic stability, linking every living mind, every ghost, every spectral echo into a unified consciousness. This unprecedented act of unity allowed them to navigate the first manifestations of consequence, guiding citizens through shifting spaces, stabilizing spectral echoes, and countering the subtle manipulations of reality. Even so, the effort cost them dearly. Minds were strained beyond endurance. Some Farseers required centuries of psychic recuperation, even as seconds passed in physical time. Eldar Ulthran understood that the trial was designed to reveal more than flaws. It exposed potential. The Celestial's judgment was multifaceted, simultaneously punishing misdeeds while highlighting the capacity for adaptation and transcendence. Eandon's survival depended not on weapons, strategy, or cunning, but on the civilization's ability to navigate consequence, accept reality, and align essence with understanding. In the midst of this, a horrifying vision struck Eldar with clarity. He saw Eandon consumed by fire and void, not through chaos or imperium, but by the sheer inevitability of failure. Time and space folded upon themselves, recreating every misstep the Eldar had ever made into a cascading sequence of annihilation. Yet in the same vision, he glimpsed the possibility of salvation, a path forged not through power, but through acceptance, courage, and unity, a rare alignment of choice, essence, and cosmic favor. The craft world began to respond, ghost warriors phased with precision, guided by the Council's lattice. Aspect warriors navigated fractured streets, shielding civilians and maintaining order against incomprehensible phenomena. Farseers channeled psychic energy to stabilize temporal loops, drawing coherence from chaos. Every act of clarity, courage, and insight became a bulwark against the destructive potential of consequence, reinforcing the craft world's fragile existence. Yet the pressure did not abate. The Celestial's gaze intensified further, probing deeper into the collective psyche of the Eldar. Each failure, each hesitation, created echoes of possibility that threatened to collapse the lattice and unravel reality itself. Even as Eandon stabilized portions of the craft world, new fractures emerged elsewhere, demanding constant adaptation. Amid the chaos, Eldar realized an even graver truth. The trial of consequence was not a singular event. It was a continuum, an unending series of challenges designed to test the very limits of civilization, perception, and essence. Passing one phase only revealed the next, more severe challenge. Eandon could survive the first manifestations, but the future promised horrors beyond imagination. And yet, in the heart of despair, a flicker of determination endured. The Eldar recognized that survival was possible not through avoidance, but through confrontation, understanding, and alignment with the essence the Celestials demanded. They were no longer merely a civilization under observation. They had become active participants in the cosmic trial, shaping their own fate within the constraints imposed by beings beyond comprehension. As the craft world trembled, phasing and looping under the immense weight of consequence, Eandon's citizens, warriors, and ghosts alike understood the stark reality. This was no longer a test of skill or strategy. This was a test of being, and failure was not merely death. It was erasure, extinction, and oblivion. In that crucible of existence, the Eldar steeled themselves. The second trial had begun in earnest, and survival required unity, clarity, and courage on a scale never before demanded. And in the silent void between stars, the Celestials watched, impartial and absolute, shaping destiny with the precision of eternity itself. What does it mean to stand on the edge of annihilation and know that not only your life, but the very essence of your civilization is under scrutiny by beings whose awareness spans beyond comprehension? Eandon quivered beneath the pressure of judgment. The first trial had tested understanding. The second trial had imposed consequence. Now the Celestials escalated the challenge, pushing the craft world to the limits of perception, essence, and survival. The very air shimmered with an unnatural weight. Light bent in impossible angles, time dilated and contracted erratically, and the cries of ghosts and living Eldar intertwined in a cacophony that defied reason. The universe itself seemed to tremble. Eldrad Ulthran, standing at the center of the psychic lattice, felt the first tendrils of dread coil around his mind. The visions were no longer distant possibilities, they were immediate, overwhelming, and alive. Entire cities shifted through alternate realities, merging past, present, and future into labyrinthine loops. Ghost warriors flickered between existence and non-existence, caught in recursive battles with shadows of themselves. Even the aspect warriors, trained for millennia to face horrors beyond comprehension, struggled to orient themselves in the disorienting sprawl of shifting reality. The Celestials' gaze intensified, piercing deeper into the essence of Eandon. This was no longer merely observation or consequence. It was a crucible, a test of being itself. The Eldar could not hope to hide, manipulate, or deceive. Every thought, every emotion, every latent desire was laid bare and evaluated. Their civilization, proud and ancient, faced the ultimate measure. Would Eandon endure, or would it dissolve under the weight of its own existence? In the council chamber, Eldrad convened the Farseers and the Council of Seers. The room hummed with psychic tension, walls vibrating as though alive with the power of the Titanic Watchers. "The third trial approaches," he warned, his voice steady yet strained. "This is no longer a test of insight or adaptation. This is a test of essence. We must confront the truth of who we are, fully and unflinchingly, or all that we have fought to preserve will be erased." The first manifestations of the crucible became immediately apparent. Sections of Eandon's districts looped into themselves endlessly, streets folding back through time, citizens encountering spectral versions of themselves in moments both past and possible. Even Farseers found their meditations challenged as psychic currents folded over with paradoxical energy. One wrong step in thought or action could ripple across multiple realities, destabilizing the craft world itself. Swooping hawks navigated skies that alternated between solid space and intangible void. Each flight became an exercise in probability manipulation, requiring instinct, foresight, and calm beyond measure. Dire Avengers faced opponents that were not physical, but conceptual manifestations of doubt, fear, and past mistakes made tangible. Howling, Banshee's wails became weapons against temporal dissonance, cutting through loops of possibility while their own minds struggled to stay tethered to reality. The first cracks in Eandon's resolve appeared among civilians. Some faltered, their minds overwhelmed by the simultaneous perception of multiple outcomes. Children, sensing the weight of judgment, screamed at visions of cities collapsing in impossible ways. Priests, artisans, and scholars wrestled with revelations that shattered long-held beliefs, forcing them to confront centuries of hubris and denial. Even the ghosts of fallen warriors, normally bound in discipline, experienced fracturing as their memories collided with alternate possibilities of life and death. The Farseers recognized a critical pattern. Clarity, acceptance, and courage formed stabilizing nodes in the fabric of the craft world. Every act of truth, every admission of failure, every embrace of potential rather than denial became a bulwark against the destabilizing influence of the Celestials. Conversely, hesitation, pride, and avoidance amplified fractures, threatening to collapse entire districts into paradoxical voids. The lesson was clear. Survival required unity and the courage to confront the unvarnished truth of existence. Eldrad and the Council initiated an unprecedented psychic alignment, weaving together the thoughts and memories of all Eldar capable of participating in the lattice. Ghosts, warriors, and seers combined their awareness into a single, coherent pattern, creating a psychic counterweight to the Celestials' influence. The process was exhausting, mentally and spiritually. Farseers wept as they confronted centuries of mistakes. Aspect warriors faced visions of their own deaths and betrayals. Ghosts relived battles they had hoped to forget. Yet in this crucible, the craft world began to stabilize, demonstrating the resilience of collective understanding. Even with stabilization, the Celestials intensified the trial. Time became fluid. Past events redefined themselves in the light of perception. Citizens encountered versions of themselves who had made different choices, each interaction highlighting flaws, virtues, and latent potential. Spectral echoes enacted alternate histories, forcing Eldar to confront what might have been. For the first time, the boundaries between life, death, and possibility blurred entirely. In essence, XXT real theater not merely adapt to observation or consequence, but survive as a coherent entity under the most extreme conditions. The trial was not merely survival, it was evolution. Eandon had to demonstrate not strength, nor strategy, nor skill, but the ability to endure and maintain coherence when reality itself unraveled. Amid this crucible, the first act of transcendence appeared. Sections of the craft world that had been unstable coalesced into coherent, stable zones, guided by collective clarity and psychic resonance. Ghosts stabilized, spectral forms aligning with living counterparts. Aspect warriors found paths through fracturing streets, guided by foresight and unity. Even the citizens, when faced with visions of loss and paradox, began to navigate alternate realities with growing comprehension. Yet, the pressure remained unrelenting. The Celestials' judgment was impartial and absolute, pushing Eandon to the limits of endurance. Every mistake, hesitation, or failure created cascading effects that threatened to unravel the entire craft world. Time itself became a weapon, memory a battlefield, and perception the line between survival and obliteration. In a moment of grim clarity, Eldrad understood the ultimate lesson of the Crucible. Eandon's survival would not be measured in victories, battles, or tactical genius. It would be measured in the capacity to confront truth, embrace consequence, and unify essence across all forms of existence. Only by aligning thought, soul, and action could the craft world withstand the scrutiny of beings whose comprehension exceeded infinity. The final stage of the trial had yet to come, but the Eldar felt the first brush of hope. They had endured understanding and consequence. They had stabilized fractured reality through clarity and courage. The crucible was far from over. But Eandon had begun to prove its capacity for coherence and survival. And in the void, where time, space, and reality twisted under the gaze of titanic observers, the Celestials remained impartial. Their judgment was ongoing, relentless, and absolute, and Eandon's fate, though not yet sealed, teetered on the razor's edge between extinction and transcendence. What happens when comprehension and consequence are no longer sufficient, when the very survival of a civilization is measured not in potential, but in its ability to endure the raw force of absolute judgment? Eandon had endured the trials of understanding, consequence, and existence itself. Yet the Celestials' gaze, now sharpened and relentless, began to manifest tangible threats, making abstract judgment brutally real. Sections of the craft world shifted violently, folding into impossible geometries, and entire districts flickered between being and non-being. Ghost warriors phased in and out, their forms tearing at the edges of reality, while living Eldar struggled to navigate streets that no longer adhered to conventional physics. The trial had become a crucible of immediate survival. Eldrad Ulthran felt the weight of infinity pressing upon him as he stood at the center of the psychic lattice. The visions of what could be and what had been merged with terrible clarity. Entire fleets, spectral armies, and ghosts of fallen warriors moved in recursive loops, enacting alternate histories that threatened to collapse the craft world. The Celestials were no longer testing patience or comprehension. They were now imposing conditions that could annihilate existence itself. From the depths of the craft world's spires came reports of strange anomalies. Gravity reversed intermittently, forcing citizens to cling desperately to walls and ceilings. Temporal loops trapped entire districts, creating moments that repeated endlessly while the rest of reality marched forward. Even the aspect warriors' most disciplined minds wavered, sensing a creeping entropy that could erase them without warning. This was no mere trial. It was the first existential manifestation of the Celestials' judgment. The council convened once more, their faces etched with both fear and determination. "This is the culmination of consequence and essence," Eldrad Ulthran intoned. "We have stabilized what we can, but the Celestials demand more. Now we must endure the direct test of survival. Our choices, our clarity, our unity will be the measure that determines if Eandon persists or is erased from the fabric of existence entirely." The first tangible threat emerged in the form of temporal predators, manifestations of possible annihilation made real by the Celestials' judgment. These entities were neither fully physical nor fully psychic, existing in a liminal state that allowed them to phase in and out of reality at will. They were echoes of outcomes in which Eandon failed, distilled into entities of pure existential threat. Every step they took left distortions in the warp, tearing at the craft world's fragile stability. Swooping hawks were first to engage, their flight a desperate ballet against impossible trajectories. Each predator anticipated movements not just in space, but across probability, countering instinct and strategy with a precision that defied comprehension. Dire avengers and howling banshees engaged in simultaneous psychic and physical combat, their weapons slicing through phantasms that could erase both body and memory. Even guardians struggled to shield civilians as sections of the craft world flickered in and out of temporal coherence. Within the psychic lattice, the Farseers attempted to map the Predator's patterns, but each calculation revealed more complexity than the human mind, or even the Eldar mind, could handle. The entities were not merely attacking, they were testing adaptability under absolute conditions. Every failure to respond correctly reinforced their threat, destabilizing surrounding districts and triggering recursive loops of destruction. Amid the chaos, Eldrad Ulthrin realized the terrifying logic of the Celestials' methods. The Predators were the consequences of failure given form, a literal embodiment of annihilation's inevitability. Their presence forced the Eldar to confront every misstep, every hubris-laden decision, every unacknowledged weakness in real time. The trial of survival had become a war against potential oblivion itself. The Craftworld responded with everything it had. Ghost warriors, normally confined to spectral patrols, phased into the liminal space of the Predators, striking at them while maintaining resonance with the lattice. Aspect warriors adapted their combat techniques, integrating foresight with improvisation to counter the unpredictable forms of their adversaries. Farseers worked tirelessly to stabilize temporal rifts, weaving psychic threads of coherence across the fractured Craftworld. Yet the cost was immense. The psychic lattice groaned under strain, threatening to collapse. Ghosts and living Eldar alike were subjected to mine, shattering temporal feedback, replaying their worst moments in impossible loops. Entire districts experienced moments of erasure, only to reappear as shadows of what they had been. Death, memory, and probability merged into a singular, unyielding challenge. Survive, or be removed from existence entirely. As the battle raged, the Farseers glimpsed the pattern within the chaos. The Celestials were forcing Eandon to act as a cohesive organism, linking thought, will, and action across every level of the Craftworld. Individual heroics were insufficient. Survival depended on collective essence, on unifying the living, the dead, and the spectral into a coherent response. Every act of coordination, every admission of failure, every embrace of clarity reinforced the Craftworld's stability against the existential predators. Eldrad Ulthrin recognized that the Celestials' test was not merely for the Craftworld. It was for the Eldar themselves. They were being compelled to evolve, to transcend individual limitations and unify their civilization's essence against forces beyond comprehension. The Predators were the ultimate trial of adaptability, comprehension, and essence manifested as immediate danger. Through a combination of psychic ingenuity, disciplined warfare, and profound courage, Eandon began to stabilize sections of the Craftworld. Ghost warriors formed psychic anchors, maintaining coherence in temporal loops. Aspect warriors created corridors of stability through shifting districts, guiding civilians and combatants alike. Farseers channeled immense power to suppress local distortions, allowing the Craftworld to hold together in the face of annihilation. Yet the Celestials' influence was relentless. The Predators adapted continuously, learning from each response, exploiting any hesitation or flaw. The trial was far from over, and the Eldar understood that survival required not just endurance but continual evolution, thinking, acting, and existing in harmony with the essence of Eandon. Failure in thought, emotion, or action could unravel everything they had fought to preserve. Amid the chaos, a moment of grim clarity struck Eldrad Ulthrin. The Celestials were not acting as conquerors or destroyers. They were measuring the capacity of Eandon to withstand annihilation while retaining coherence of essence. Survival was no longer about skill, strategy, or foresight alone. It was about unity, clarity, courage, and the willingness to confront absolute judgment without flinching. As the existential predators loomed over the Craftworld, their forms phasing between realities, Eandon's Eldar rallied. Ghost warriors, aspect warriors, and citizens alike synchronized their efforts through the psychic lattice. Clarity, courage, and acceptance of consequence became weapons in themselves, stabilizing reality and allowing the Craftworld to withstand the pressure of annihilation. The first phase of the trial of annihilation had reached its peak. Eandon remained intact, though battered and trembling, a civilization tested beyond the limits of comprehension. The Celestials' gaze, impartial and absolute, had forced the Eldar to confront the full spectrum of their existence, to unify essence, and to endure the immediate threat of literal obliteration. And as the cosmic watchers observed, Eandon's Eldar understood a truth that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Survival depended not on power, not on weapons, not on cunning, but on confronting reality, embracing consequence, and uniting the full essence of their civilization against the unimaginable. The next phase of the Celestials' judgment loomed, promising trials of even greater complexity and intensity. But for now, Eandon had endured, proving that even under the gaze of titanic beings, even in the crucible of annihilation, their civilization retained the capacity to act as a coherent, unified, and resilient entity. And in the silent void where stars themselves seemed to pause, the Celestials' gaze remained fixed, impartial, and eternal, awaiting the next act of judgment that would determine whether Eandon would ascend beyond reckoning or vanish entirely from existence. What becomes of a civilization when its every thought, action, and essence is laid bare before beings older than time itself? When the weight of eternity rests upon every decision, and survival hinges not on strength or cunning, but on the unflinching acknowledgement of one's own existence. Eandon had endured trials unlike any in its storied history. It had faced comprehension beyond mortal or Eldar understanding, consequences that spanned eons, the crucible of existence itself, and the tangible threat of annihilation made real. Yet even as sections of the craft world shimmered with hard-won stability, the Eldar knew the ultimate test had not yet come. The Celestials' gaze now fixed upon them with the inevitability of a collapsing star, absolute, impartial, eternal. Eldrad Ulthran stood at the heart of the psychic lattice, feeling the pulse of every mind, every ghost, every living citizen of Eandon. The craft world itself vibrated with anticipation, reality stretched to its limits as the final phase approached. In the silence of this moment, broken only by the whisper of the warp and the shifting of time itself, Eldrad asked a question that no voice could answer. Have we endured enough to survive? Ultimate judgment, the Celestials' presence intensified, manifesting not as entities of flesh, but as pure awareness that pierced the veil of being. Light bent into impossible geometries, illuminating every flaw, every triumph, every act of pride or humility in the Eldar Empire. Time fractured, allowing past, present, and potential futures to collide simultaneously. Ghosts of warriors long dead walked beside the living, each encounter a lesson, a warning, a possibility of what could have been and what might yet come. The first trial of the final verdict was clarity. Every Eldar, living and spectral, was forced to confront their deepest truths. Failures, betrayals, and acts of pride replayed with the clarity of an unforgiving mirror. Ghost warriors relived battles lost, and aspect warriors faced decisions that had once seemed inconsequential, but whose echoes reverberated across millennia. The craft world itself trembled as the lattice absorbed the full weight of self-awareness, every psychic and material fragment exposed to judgment. Amid this, the Eldar began to understand the logic of the Celestials. The verdict was not mere punishment, nor was it reward. It was the measurement of essence, the ability of a civilization to recognize itself fully, to act with coherence, courage, and honesty under the gaze of infinity. Eandon's survival depended not on manipulation, not on weapons, not on cunning, but on the ability to unite its essence and confront the truth of its existence without falter. The second trial was consequence on a cosmic scale. Temporal loops, paradoxes, and spectral anomalies intensified beyond prior thresholds. Entire districts flickered between reality and non-reality. Citizens encountered alternate versions of themselves, each one embodying choices made differently or left unmade. Spectral predators, manifestations of annihilation, tore through the craft world, testing the Eldar's unity and adaptability. Even the psychic lattice, strained under the weight of possibilities, multiplied infinitely. Eldrad Ulthrin's mind stretched to its limits as he coordinated the Eldar's response. Ghost warriors phased into liminal spaces, intercepting threats. Aspect warriors guided civilians and spectral allies through shifting realities. Farseers stabilized paradoxes with psychic precision. Each act of clarity, courage, and alignment reinforced the craft world, creating nodes of stability against the relentless pressure of the Celestials' judgment. Yet the final trial demanded transcendence. The Celestials' gaze now reached into the very essence of Eandon, probing beyond perception into the core of what it meant to be Eldar. The craft world itself became a reflection of potentiality. Every spire, every citizen, every ghost a living testament to choice, consequence, and essence. The Eldar understood the final verdict would not only measure survival, it would determine whether Eandon could exist as a coherent entity within the universe, or whether it would be erased as if it had never been. In this crucible, unity became the ultimate weapon. Eldrad coordinated the psychic lattice with unprecedented precision, linking every living mind, every spectral echo, every fragment of memory and foresight into a single, coherent consciousness. Eandon responded as one organism, a civilization manifesting its essence with clarity, courage, and acceptance. Ghost warriors anchored the spectral folds of reality. Aspect warriors stabilized physical and metaphysical paths, and citizens embraced the truths of themselves and their empire, reinforcing craft world's coherence. The Celestials observed, their awareness piercing and absolute, as Eandon's unified essence began to resonate with cosmic symmetry. Flaws and failures were acknowledged without denial. Victories and virtues were embraced without pride. The craft world's reality, once fractured and unstable, began to stabilize across multiple dimensions. The temporal predators, manifestations of annihilation, receded into the liminal folds of possibility, neutralized by the strength of comprehension and unity. Eldrad Ulthrin felt the pulse of the final judgment, a weight so immense that it threatened to shatter his mind. And then, in the stillness, he understood the conclusion. Eandon had endured, not by strength, nor by weapons, nor by cunning, but through clarity, courage, and the unflinching embrace of essence. The craft world, its people, and its ghosts had demonstrated the capacity to survive under the gaze of infinity itself. Yet, even in triumph, a lingering unease remained. The Celestials did not celebrate, nor did they punish further. Their verdict was absolute, impartial, eternal. Eandon had survived, but the gaze of the cosmos remained, a constant reminder that existence was never guaranteed, and that the universe measured all civilizations not in victories, but in essence. The craft world, battered and transformed, began to return to relative stability. Ghost warriors phased back into their patrols, aspect warriors resumed disciplined formations, and civilians, though shaken, regained composure. Farseers meditated, reflecting on the revelations of the judgment and the responsibility of knowing that existence itself had been questioned and found worthy. Eldrad Ulthrin stood at the center of the lattice, gazing out at the stars. The Celestials, still beyond comprehension, had left their mark not only on Eandon's civilization, but on the souls of every Eldar who had endured. They had revealed the fragility, potential, and resilience of a civilization that had survived millennia of war and chaos, and now, under the gaze of beings older than time, had proven its capacity to endure the ultimate scrutiny. And yet, as the craft world stabilized, Eldrad sensed the subtle truth that lingered like a shadow across eternity. The Celestials' judgment was ongoing, eternal, and incomprehensible. Eandon had survived, but the universe had revealed its scale, its impartiality, and its capacity to judge without mercy. The Eldar had faced annihilation, consequence, and the crucible of being itself, and they had endured. But the awareness of such forces left a lingering unease. Survival was a gift, never a guarantee, and the eyes of eternity were always watching. In the quiet aftermath, as the stars above Eendon shimmered with an unfamiliar clarity, the Eldar understood that their civilization had changed irrevocably. They had glimpsed the infinite, endured judgment beyond comprehension, and emerged as one with the essence of their existence. They had survived the gaze of the Celestials, but in doing so, they had been forever altered, more aware, more fragile, yet more united than ever. And somewhere, in the vast expanse of the cosmos where comprehension and eternity merged, the Celestials continued to watch, their judgment impartial and eternal. Eandon had passed, but the universe remained vast, incomprehensible, and unyielding, a constant reminder that even the mightiest civilizations are but fleeting sparks under the gaze of infinity.